The auctioneer's voice was a greasy drone, slick with false cheer as it slid over the murmuring crowd. "And who'll start the bidding for this fine, hardy specimen, strong for her size, quiet, and don't ask questions? A perfect addition to any homestead in need of an extra pair of hands." The whip cracked. It wasn't meant to strike, only to silence the whispers that rippled through the sun-bleached citizens of Bellstone. But the girl flinched anyway, a tremor that ran through her small frame like a chill. Her name was Clara, though no one had called her that in months. To the man whose calloused fingers were a vice around her wrist, she was property. The girl, the brat, the leftover. She stood on the raised platform outside the saloon, the raw pine boards hot beneath her bare feet. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. Dust, fine as flour, coated her tattered dress and clung to the tear tracks on her cheeks, long since dried. She was 12 years old, but hunger and grief had whittled her down, making her look younger, smaller, breakable. She didn't cry anymore. She had used up all her tears the day they came for her mama Lita. Now she just stared, her gaze drifting over the sea of faces, men in sweat-stained hats, women with weary lines etched around their eyes. They looked, and then they looked away. Children were trouble another mouth to feed. Bad luck to take in, and worse luck to ask questions about. The man holding her Harlon coil was a traitor, known more for his whiskey breath than his mercy. He shoved her forward. Last one of the day, he called out a flash of yellow teeth under a greasy mustache. Guaranteed to work till she drops. Clara's hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, balled into fists. She wasn't strong. She wasn't quiet. She was just numb, hollowed out by a memory that played on a loop behind her eyes. It was this same platform, this same merciless sun. Her mother, tall and trembling, had stood where she stood now. Lita's hand had squeezed hers, a silent promise that shattered the moment it was pried away. Just a job, they'd said. A housekeeper out west. Lita never came back. Now Clara stood where her mama once did, knees locked, throat burning with unspoken rage. The crowd shifted, but no one spoke. No one stepped forward. Then she saw it. A flash of color in the drab tableau. A woman near the front, fanning herself with a folded circular, had a simple red ribbon tied in her hair. The sight was a key turning in a rusted lock. Suddenly, Clara wasn't in Bellstone anymore. She was back in their tiny one-room shack, the air thick with the smell of soap and Lita's humming. Her mother was tying a matching red ribbon into Clara's braid, her fingers gentle. Red means freedom, mi cielito. Lita had whispered, her voice like warm honey. It means you belong only to yourself. One day when you're old enough, this one will be yours too. She had touched the ribbon in her own dark hair, the one she'd worn every day since Clara could remember. It was a promise, a prayer tied in silk. The memory was so sharp, so real, Clara could almost feel her mother's hand in hers. The auctioneer's voice dragged her back. "Do I hear $10, a pittance for a lifetime of labor?" A boot scraped against the dirt. Slow, deliberate. The sound cut through the noise, heavy with intent. Clara didn't lift her head. She was too used to disappointment, to hearing men say, "too skinny," or "don't want no orphans," or worse. But this time, the silence that followed the bootstep dragged on. The air grew thick with it. The boot stopped just beneath the platform. Slowly fighting against the weight of her despair, Clara looked up. She saw him. The man was tall, not just in height, but in presence. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn duster, his hat pulled low over eyes that watched her like a storm watches dry land. He wasn't looking at Harlan or the auctioneer. He was looking at her, and the expression on his weathered face was a deep, unsettling frown. His name was Thatcher Reed, though Clara wouldn't know it for hours, and he carried the vast, unforgiving expanse of the plains in the set of his jaw. "What's her name?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it sliced through the heat and the silence. Harlan Coyle tried to laugh, a wheezing, uncertain sound. "Doesn't matter. She don't talk much. You want her or not?" Thatcher's eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed. He didn't break his gaze from Clara. For a long, suspended breath, she held it. Something in her stomach twisted. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something sharper, like standing too close to a fire that hadn't yet decided whether to warm you or burn you alive. How much? Thatcher asked. Harlan named a price far too high for a child, a price meant to scare off anyone who might ask too many questions. Thatcher didn't blink. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a solid, final thud. "Come on," he said to Clara. She didn't move her feet, rooted to the spot where her mother had last stood. "Come on, girl," Harlan hissed, reaching out to shove her forward. Thatcher moved so fast, the dust didn't have time to settle. He was between them in an instant, his body a solid wall. "She walks on her own," he said, his voice flat and cold as riverstone. "Or the deal's off." Clara stared. No one had ever spoken for her like that. Not since her mother was taken. Her legs, seemingly of their own accord, moved before her mind caught up. She stepped off the platform, landing beside him, unsteady but upright. "Your name?" he asked again. His voice, softer now, meant only for her. Her lips parted. She hadn't said it aloud in so long it felt foreign on her tongue. "Clara," she whispered the sound, barely a breath. He gave a single curt nod. Then they walked. No more words, no questions. Just the sound of his heavy boots and her bare feet on the dirt as they moved away, leaving the platform, the auctioneer, and Harlan Coyle behind. The crowd parted for them, their gazes following, and then, as if a spell had been broken, they went back to pretending nothing had happened at all. They rode west for hours, leaving the squalor of Bellstone behind, for a landscape of low, rolling hills and skeletal trees. The sun dipped below the horizon, smearing the sky with shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. Clara sat in front of Thatcher on his horse, a stoic gelding named Ash, her small body, rigid, her hands clutching the saddle horn until her knuckles were white. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving town, and the silence felt both terrifying and strangely safe. He finally stopped near a shallow stream that gurgled over smooth gray stones. He dismounted with a quiet grunt and helped Clara down. His hands were large and rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, expecting her to hold her own weight. She did. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He just handed her a strip of jerky and a chunk of hard bread from his saddlebag, and then set about building a fire with the practiced, economical movements of a man long accustomed to solitude. She sat on a fallen log and watched the flames catch the orange light, dancing across his grim face, illuminating the deep lines that fanned out from his eyes. He sat beside her, but kept a careful distance. "You from Bellstone?" he finally asked, his gaze fixed on the fire. "No," Clara said, her voice raspy from disuse. He nodded. "Parents?" The question hung in the cool night air. Clara stared into the fire, watching a log hiss and pop. "My mama was sold," she said, the words tasting like ash. "They said it was for work. She never came back." She paused, the memory of the red ribbon flaring in her mind. She had a ribbon, Clara whispered more to herself than to him. A red one. Said it meant freedom. Said she'd give it to me when I was old enough. I ain't seen it since they took her. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. Thatcher added another stick to the fire, the flames leaping up to consume it. "You still got family?" Clara shook her head. He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the stars for a moment. "You do now," he said simply. "We ride at dawn." She blinked, confusion warring with a desperate, fragile hope. "What?" Thatcher turned to meet her eyes, and in their depths she saw a flicker of something that wasn't pity, but a profound and ancient weariness. "I don't buy children," he said, his voice low and firm. "I free them." With that, he walked toward the horse, leaving Clara alone by the fire, clutching the piece of bread tighter than she had ever held anything in her life. That night she didn't sleep much. Not because of fear, but because her heart, a thing she thought had turned to stone, wouldn't stop racing. For the first time since her mother vanished, someone had spoken to her like she was real, like she mattered. And somewhere in the desolate landscape of her soul, a tiny, stubborn seed of belief began to sprout. The ride north was hard and long. They moved through a vast, unforgiving expanse of red sand and scorched rock, where the wind whispered old lonely secrets through canyons carved by time. Thatcher spoke little, but his quiet observations became a language Clara began to understand. "Deer went through here," he'd murmur, pointing to tracks she hadn't seen. "Clouds breaking west. Might get rain by nightfall." They stopped at a trading post, a sagging building that leaned like it had been bracing against the wind for 100 years. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of dust-dried meat and chewing tobacco. An old man behind the counter eyed Clara with open suspicion. "Don't look like kin," the man muttered. Thatcher's gaze was flat. "Ain't your business." He bought flour coffee and a small pair of sturdy leather boots. He slid them across the counter toward Clara without a word. She stared at them, then at him. I don't." "They'll fit," he cut her off, his voice gruff. "Your feet are bleeding." Clara looked down and saw he was right. The ache had become so normal, she'd stopped noticing the source. She pulled the boots on the stiff leather, pinching at first, but she didn't care. She kept glancing down at them as they rode, half afraid they might vanish if she looked away for too long. By nightfall of the second day, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide, sheltered valley. Below, lit faintly by the rising moon, stood a small cabin, a barn, and a fenced-in pasture. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the faint, rhythmic creak of a windmill carried on the breeze. "That's it," Thatcher said. Clara's throat tightened. They descended the trail slowly until the land flattened out. Thatcher dismounted, opened a gate, and led Ash inside. He helped her down, then stood back, gesturing to the simple homestead. "This is your home now," he said. She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But I don't know how to be in a house." He raised a single questioning eyebrow. "You know how to breathe." She nodded. "Then you'll figure the rest." He didn't say it kindly. He said it like a fact. And somehow that made it easier to believe. The cabin was simple and clean. One main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area to the side, and a ladder leading to a sleeping loft. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, solitude. While Thatcher started a stew, Clara moved through the room, her fingers hovering over the back of a chair and the edge of a well-scrubbed table, a folded quilt. It felt sacred, terrifying. Over supper, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her since Bellstone. "Why did you take me?" He didn't look up from his bowl. "Seen too many children sold," he said. "Stood by. Didn't stop it. Thought maybe this time I could." He paused and then met her gaze. "And you looked like someone who needed a place to be more than just a name on a bill of sale." Her own story spilled out, and then a quiet, halting confession. They said I was like her. My mama said I had her eyes, and that's why Harlan took me. Said he couldn't stand the way I looked at him. She bit her lip, the memory sharp. I thought maybe God forgot about me. Thatcher's jaw tensed. He didn't, he said, his voice rough. But some men pretend he don't see. Those are the ones who need reminding. Later, he showed her the loft. A small bed with clean sheets and a thick wool blanket waited for her. She touched the quilt like it was spun gold. As he descended the ladder, she called after him. Thatcher, he turned. What am I to you? A hand, a worker. He hesitated, the firelight casting his face in shadow. No? Then what am I? She pressed her voice a whisper. He looked at her, and the weariness in his eyes seemed to deepen into something else, something closer to a vow. You're Clara Reed, he said. That's enough. Then he left her with that name echoing in her ears, the most beautiful and terrifying lie she had ever heard. Peace, Clara soon learned, had a rhythm. It was the creak of the floorboards at dawn as Thatcher started the fire. It was the soft lowing of the 2 cows in the barn, the clucking of the chickens. In the first few weeks, she moved like a phantom through this rhythm, a ghost haunting the edges of a life she didn't feel she'd earned. What do you want me to do today? She asked that first morning, her hands clenched in her lap. Thatcher sipped his coffee. See something that needs doing, do it. If you don't, you rest. It's that simple. But I'm not earning my keep. She insisted, the words ingrained in her by years of servitude. He leaned back his chair, groaning in protest. This ain't about earning. His words were a locked door she didn't have the key for. She expected him to send her away, to grow tired of her silence and the sadness that clung to her like trail dust. You will when I mess up, she stated, a fact, not a question. Thatcher's eyes sharpened. You will mess up, he said. So will I. That's life. Doesn't mean I throw you away. But that's what folks do. Not here. The finality in his voice was an anchor. Slowly, tentatively, she began to do things. She swept the barn aisle. She turned the soil in the small garden patch behind the cabin. She learned to milk the cows, her small hands clumsy at first, then growing sure. Thatcher never hovered, never shouted. He corrected her once, his large hand guiding hers, then left her to it. He trusted her to learn, and that trust was a more powerful teacher than fear had ever been. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they sat on the porch in the gathering twilight. She finally found the courage to ask, "Did you have a daughter?" The pipe he was lighting paused halfway to his lips. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets. "A wife," he finally said, his voice tight. "Sarah." He took a slow drag of the ember, glowing like a dying star. Cancer came fast. Took her faster. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. He didn't nod or say thank you. He just looked out over the fields, his jaw a hard line. "I see her sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "In dreams. Or when the light hits the table just right." He cleared his throat. "She'd have liked you." Clara's heart clenched. No one had ever said anything like that to her. She didn't know how to respond, so she just sat with the words, letting them settle into her chest like something warm and precious. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing, a delicate truce with a harsh world. 3 weeks after she arrived, trouble rode into their valley. It came in the form of a lone rider. His name was Pierce, and he moved with a sly, predatory grace. Thatcher saw him coming from a mile off and grabbed the rifle from its pegs above the door. Inside, he told Clara, his voice low. She didn't argue. From the window, she watched Pierce dismount his spurs, jingling with false confidence. He had a thin smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Morning, Reed," Pierce called out as Thatcher stepped onto the porch. "State your business." Thatcher said, the rifle held loosely at his side. "My business is a girl. Harlan Coyle sent me. He says she's his property." "She's not." Pierce chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "That's a funny thing. See, he's got papers. Says he paid for her. Says she ran off." "She didn't run," Thatcher said, his voice like ice. "She walked. And I paid." Pierce's smile tightened. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the ranch, the sturdy barn, the well-tended garden. "A man can't be faulted for wanting to reclaim his property," he said, his voice laced with a strange, sly wit. "Especially property that carries sentimental value." Thatcher didn't respond. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. Pierce's gaze flickered toward the cabin window where Clara was hiding. "Look, I ain't here to start nothing. You give us the girl and we'll be on our way. No one gets hurt." "She's not yours," Thatcher repeated. "She is now," he replied, his voice hard. A long, tense silence fell over the yard. Pierce seemed to be measuring Thatcher, weighing the cost of a fight. Then his eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition in them. "You know," he said slowly, "some debts don't get settled just by riding away, especially debts from Pine Ridge." The name hit Thatcher like a physical blow. Clara saw it from the window, the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the sudden, sharp intake of breath. The rifle in his hands no longer looked loose. "Get off my land," Thatcher said, his voice a low growl. Pierce held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy now. Just delivering a message." He backed away slowly, swung into his saddle, and reined his horse around. But before he rode off, he looked directly at Thatcher, his thin smile returning. Harlan never forgets a face, especially one that belongs to a coward. He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of dread in his wake. The dust hadn't even settled before Clara burst through the door. What did he mean? What's Pine Ridge? Thatcher stared down the empty trail, his face a mask of stone. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice was strained. "Just an old trouble." "You'll send me away now," she whispered, the old fear clawing at her throat. "To keep the trouble from your door." He finally looked at her, and the raw pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "The trouble's already here. It's been here for years." He took a deep breath. "I've done a lot I ain't proud of, Clara. I've run from things I should have faced. But this..." He looked from her face to the cabin, to the land he'd carved out of the wilderness. "This I'll fight for." She swallowed hard. "Even if it gets you killed." He nodded once. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a solemn vow. "Then I'll fight too." That night, as Thatcher taught her how to load and fire the old rifle, its stock heavy and awkward in her small hands. Clara knew her life had been divided into two parts: the time before she came to the valley and the time after. The first part had been about survival. This part, she realized as she learned to hold her breath and squeeze the trigger, was about standing her ground. The threat from Harlan Coyle did not return immediately. Instead, it festered, a poison seeping into the peace of the valley. A week after Pierce's visit, Thatcher sent a larger group, 4 riders who circled the property at a distance. Their presence, a silent, constant menace. They never came close, but they were always there, shadows on the ridge at sunrise, dark silhouettes against the moon at night. Thatcher began to fortify the ranch. He and Clara worked side by side, their shared purpose, a silent conversation. They reinforced the cabin door with an iron bar, boarded up the smaller windows, and dug a shallow trench around the barn. The work was hard, but it felt right. It felt like fighting back. His shooting lessons grew more intense. He set up empty bottles on the fence posts, teaching her to breathe, to aim, to anticipate the rifle's kick. "Don't think about the man," he told her, his voice grim as he adjusted her stance. "Think about the threat. You're not taking a life. You're protecting one." Her arms ached, and a permanent bruise blossomed on her shoulder, but she never complained. She hit 2 bottles out of 6, then 3. The small, grim nod of approval he gave her meant more than any praise. One hot afternoon, while reinforcing a fence line far from the cabin, Thatcher suddenly cried out. Clara spun around to see him stumbling backward, his face ashen. Coiled in the tall grass near a post hole was a rattlesnake, its tail a blur of angry sound. "Thatcher!" she screamed, running to him. He was already slumping against the fence, his hand clutching his calf, where 2 dark puncture marks were beginning to swell and discolor. "Go!" He rasped his breath, coming in ragged gasps. "Get back to the cabin." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. But Thatcher's voice cut through it. "Clara, the kit, under my bed. Now." She ran. Her lungs burned, her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't slow down. She found the small wooden box, grabbed the whiskey and a knife, and raced back. By the time she returned, he was slick with sweat, his legs swollen to twice its normal size. Following his choked instructions, she cut across the bite, squeezed the wound, and poured whiskey over it, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the bottle. She tore strips from her dress to make a bandage. "You'll have to ride," he whispered, his eyes glassy with fever. "Bellstone. The doctor." "I can't leave you." "You can," he insisted, his fingers gripping her arm with surprising strength. "And you will. Take Ash. Ride hard, don't stop." She looked at the long, empty trail leading out of the valley, a path she had never traveled alone. Fear was a bitter taste in her mouth. But then she looked at Thatcher, his face pale, his life seeping away into the dry earth, and a different feeling rose to meet it, resolve. She saddled Ash with frantic energy, filled a canteen, and tied Thatcher's rifle to the saddle. Before she mounted, she knelt beside him. "I'll be back," she promised, her voice thick with unshed tears. His eyes were barely open, but they found hers. "You're my daughter." He said the words slurred but clear. "Don't you ever forget it." The journey to Bellstone was a nightmare of dust and fear. Every shadow seemed to hold one of Coyle's men. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. But Clara pushed on, repeating Thatcher's words like a prayer. "You're my daughter." She rode into Bellstone at dawn, a small, grim figure on a tired horse. The town was just waking up, but she ignored the stares and went straight to the doctor's office. She hammered on the door until a gray-haired man in his nightshirt answered, blinking sleepily. "Help me," she pleaded. "It's Thatcher Reed. Rattlesnake bite. He's bad." The doctor, a man named Hervey, recognized the name and moved quickly. As he gathered his supplies, the bell above the door jingled. Clara turned, her heart freezing in her chest. Harlan Coyle stood there, a cruel, knowing smirk on his face. He'd clearly been waiting for her. "Well now," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Look what the wind blew in. The little crow come home to roost." "I'm here for the doctor." Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. "She's with me," Dr. Hervey said sternly, stepping between them. "Reed's been bit. I'm riding out." Harlan's eyes narrowed into slits. Why waste good medicine on a fool who sticks his hand where it don't belong? He took a step closer, his gaze pinning Clara to the spot. His words were no longer just brutish, they were sharp, articulate, and aimed to wound. You tell your new father when you see him that some promises can't be outrun. He leaned in, his whiskey breath washing over her. Ask him about Pine Ridge. Ask him what he leaves behind in the dirt to rot. He's just a stop on the way to the grave for you, girl. Same as he was for everyone else. Clara didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a cold fire. No, she said the single word, a shield. She turned her back on him and walked out the door. The ride back was a race against death. They found Thatcher unconscious in the barn, his fever raging. Dr. Hervey worked for hours, lancing the wound, applying poultices, forcing broth between Thatcher's cracked lips. For 2 days, Clara didn't leave his side. She bathed his face with cool water, held his hand when he thrashed in delirium, and read to him from one of Sarah's old books of poetry, her voice a steady presence in the fevered darkness. On the third morning, Thatcher's eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot and clouded, but they were aware. Clara, he rasped. I'm here, she whispered, tears finally streaming down her face. He looked at her, at the exhaustion etched on her small face, and a faint smile touched his lips. You rode alone, he murmured. Good girl. He drifted back to sleep, but the fever had broken. He would live. Dr. Hervey left the next day, tipping his hat to Clara. You're braver than most men I know, child. In the weeks that followed, Clara ran the ranch. She tended the animals, chopped the wood, and cooked for Thatcher as his strength slowly returned. He would watch her from his chair on the porch, a new expression in his eyes, not just pride, but a kind of awe. She had not only survived, she had fought for him for them. The bond between them, forged in fear and defiance, now solidified into the unbreakable strength of family. But Harlan Coyle was not a man to be deterred by a single failure. His revenge, Clara would soon learn, was a patient, cruel thing. One afternoon, as Thatcher was taking his first unsteady steps around the yard, Clara was sweeping the porch. Her gaze fell on the rail near the steps, and she froze. Tied neatly around the weathered wood was a small object. It was a child's toy, a roughly carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The wood was old and gray, worn smooth by small hands. But tied around its neck, bright and stark against the aged wood, was a fresh red ribbon. It hadn't been there that morning. She called out to Thatcher, her voice tight with alarm. He limped over, his face grim. He stared at the bird, and all the color drained from his face. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its wing, a look of profound horror dawning in his eyes. What is it? Clara asked. Thatcher swallowed hard, his gaze distant, lost in a memory she couldn't see. I made this, he whispered, his voice cracking. Years ago. For a boy. A boy at Pine Ridge. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a terrible dawning understanding. This isn't about you, Clara. Not really. He picked up the bird, the red ribbon dangling from its neck like a drop of blood. This is a message. He knows. He's not just trying to take you back. He's hunting me. The fight wasn't for property. It was for his soul. The little wooden bird sat on the mantelpiece, a silent accuser. Its presence changed the air in the cabin, charging it with the ghosts of a past Thatcher had tried to bury. He was still weak, the snake venom having left a deep weariness in his bones, but a new feverish energy now burned in his eyes. That evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, rattling the window panes, he finally spoke of it. Pine Ridge wasn't just an old trouble. He began, his voice low and strained. He sat by the fire, turning the carved bird over and over in his hands. It was a land dispute. A rich man from back east wanted the valley claimed the deeds held by the families there were worthless. I was hired on as muscle, just supposed to intimidate them, get them to sell cheap. Clara sat on the floor near his chair, listening, her hands clasped around her knees. There was a family, he continued, his gaze lost in the flames. The Coyles, tenant farmers, proud people. They had a son, Daniel, a quiet boy no older than you. He liked to watch me whittle. I made him that bird. He gestured with the carving. His older brother Harlan was fierce, all fire and fury. He wouldn't back down. Thatcher fell silent, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. Things got ugly. The man who hired me, he got impatient. He wanted them gone. One night his men planned to set a fire just to scare them out. I knew it was wrong. I argued against it, but I was just a hired gun. His voice dropped to a choked whisper. So I ran. I packed my things in the middle of the night and rode away. I told myself I was getting out before blood was shed. I thought I was saving myself. But I left them there. I left that boy. He finally looked at Clara, his face a mask of self-loathing. The fire got out of control. It took their barn, their crop, everything. They were ruined. I heard later that the boy, Daniel, he got sick that winter. Without proper food or shelter, he didn't make it. He placed the bird back on the mantle. Harlan isn't after a girl he can sell. He's been hunting the man who abandoned his family. He's been hunting me, taking you. It's his way of making me watch it happen all over again. To watch another child I've sworn to protect be destroyed. Clara didn't know what to say. She saw not a coward, but a man drowning in a grief so old it had become a part of him. She reached out and placed her small hand on his arm. "You're not that man anymore," she said quietly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate gratitude. "We have to be ready, Clara. He won't send men with veiled threats this time. He'll come himself. He'll come to burn it all down." For the next 2 days, they worked with a grim, focused intensity. They boarded up the remaining windows, leaving only narrow slits for shooting. They hauled buckets of water from the stream and placed them around the cabin and barn, ready to fight the inevitable flames. They moved the animals into the most secure part of the barn and barricaded the door. The homestead, once a sanctuary, was being transformed into a fortress. The air grew heavy, pregnant with the coming violence. The sky turned a sickly yellow-gray, and the wind began to pick up a low moan that grew steadily into a howl. A dust storm was coming. "He'll use the storm for cover," Thatcher said, scanning the horizon. "He'll think it gives him the advantage." They retreated into the cabin as the first wave of sand and grit slammed against the walls. The world outside dissolved into a churning, blinding chaos of brown dust. The sun vanished. Day turned into a suffocating twilight. Inside, they lit a single lantern, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantel sounded unnaturally loud, a countdown to oblivion. The house's timbers groaned under the assault of the wind. Clara took her position at the loft window, rifle ready. Thatcher sat in his armchair near the main door, his own rifle across his lap, his face set in grim lines. The wait was agonizing. Every shriek of the wind sounded like a human scream. Every rattle of the door sounded like a boot step. Then through the howling gale came a different sound and the sharp crack of splintering wood. The back door. Thatcher was on his feet in an instant, moving toward the kitchen. A shot rang out from outside, punching a hole through the wall, inches from his head. He fired back into the darkness, a scream cut short by the wind. Suddenly, the front door burst inward, ripped from its hinges by two of Coyle's men. The dust storm poured into the room, a blinding, choking wave. The lantern flickered wildly, threatening to go out. Silhouetted against the swirling brown chaos, the men raised their pistols. From the loft, Clara fired. One of the men grunted and stumbled back, clutching his arm. The other dove for cover behind the overturned table. The battle had begun. It was a desperate, brutal fight in near darkness. Gunshots exploded, the sound muffled by the storm. Men shouted, their voices swallowed by the wind. Thatcher fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, moving through the swirling dust like a wraith. Clara fired from the loft, her shots precise and deadly, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. One of Coyle's men tried to climb the ladder to the loft. Clara met him with the butt of her rifle, sending him crashing back to the floor below. Slowly, they began to gain the upper hand. Two of the attackers lay still. A third fled back into the storm. A tense silence fell inside the cabin, broken only by the howl of the wind and their own ragged breathing. But it wasn't over. A figure emerged from the kitchen, stepping calmly out of the shadows. It was Harlan Coyle. He held a pistol in one hand, but his eyes were fixed on Thatcher, burning with a hatred that was years in the making. "Reed," he said, his voice cutting through the gale. "Did you really think these walls could keep me out?" Thatcher raised his rifle, his aim steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's over, Harlan. Leave." Harlan laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "Over. It's just beginning." He took a step forward. "My name is Harlan Coyle. But my brother was Daniel. Do you remember him, Reed? The boy you made that little bird for, the boy you left to die in the dirt at Pine Ridge for nothing?" Thatcher flinched as if struck. "You ran like a coward." Harlan screamed, his articulate facade finally cracking to reveal the raw, festering wound beneath. "You left us with nothing. My father lost the will to live. My mother wasted away. And Daniel, he coughed his lungs out in a cold shack because we couldn't afford a doctor because of you." The emotional blow was more devastating than any bullet. Thatcher's carefully constructed defenses crumbled. His rifle wavered. The guilt he had carried for years flooded his face, leaving him exposed, broken. "You took my brother," Harlan snarled, raising his pistol. "Now I take your girl, and I will leave you in this empty house with the same emptiness you left us." He aimed his pistol not at Thatcher, but at the loft where Clara stood frozen, watching the terrible scene unfold. In that split second, as Harlan's finger tightened on the trigger, Thatcher's training kicked in. He dove not away but forward, tackling Harlan around the waist. The two men crashed to the floor. Harlan's gun went off the bullet, burying itself in the ceiling beams. They wrestled on the floor, two men locked in a mortal struggle fueled by years of pain and regret. Harlan was younger, stronger. He gained the upper hand, his fingers closing around Thatcher's throat. Thatcher's face began to turn purple. His hands scrabbled uselessly at Harlan's arms. "This is for Daniel," Harlan hissed. Suddenly, a heavy object slammed into the side of Harlan's head. It was the cast-iron skillet from the stove. Clara stood over him, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes blazing with fury. She raised the skillet and brought it down again hard. Harlan's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped sideways unconscious. Clara dropped the skillet with a clatter and rushed to Thatcher's side. He lay gasping for air, clutching his throat. She knelt beside him, her small hand resting on his chest. The dust storm raged on outside, but inside the battered cabin, the battle for Thatcher Reed's soul was finally over. He had not run. He had stood his ground. And this time, he had been saved. As the dust storm exhausted itself, retreating into a bruised and weary twilight, a profound quiet settled over the valley. The wind died down to a whisper, and the world outside the cabin was remade, coated in a fine layer of red dust that softened every hard edge. Inside, the silence was heavier, filled with the weight of revelation and bloodshed. Clara helped Thatcher to his chair. He slumped into it a broken man, and the physical struggle nothing compared to the war that had just been waged within him. Harlan Coyle lay bound and unconscious by the hearth, his breathing shallow. In the flickering lantern light, Thatcher looked at Clara, his eyes stripped of all pretense. The story he had told her about Pine Ridge was only a fraction of the truth. Now, in the raw aftermath of the battle, he gave her the rest. "It was worse than I said," he began, his voice a ragged whisper. "Sarah, my wife, she knew what I was doing at Pine Ridge. She begged me to quit. She said it was blood money, that it would stain us. I didn't listen." He stared at his hands, as if seeing the stain for himself. "When I ran, we had to keep moving. We were fugitives. The man who hired me put a price on my head. We lived in fear, always looking over our shoulder. The hardship, the guilt, it wore her down. Her sickness, it didn't just happen. It took root in her sorrow. She died because of my choices, because of my cowardice." He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with tears he no longer bothered to hide. "When I saw you on that platform, Clara, I saw a chance to do it right. To stand for someone instead of running. But I brought all this down on you. I put you in his path." Clara listened, her heart aching for the depth of his pain. She crossed the room and knelt before him, taking his large, trembling hand in both of hers. She saw the full measure of the man. Now, not just the quiet strength and the gruff kindness, but the deep wounds and the profound regret. "You didn't put me in his path," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You stood in it with me. You didn't run this time." She squeezed his hand. "My mama used to say that a person isn't defined by their mistakes, but by what they do after. You stayed, Thatcher. You stayed for me." His breath hitched, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. In that moment of shared vulnerability, of complete and painful honesty, their bond was forged anew, no longer just a matter of circumstance or a deed, but a deep and abiding love, built on the foundation of their shared, broken past. He was not a perfect savior, and she was not a helpless victim. They were two survivors who had found in each other a reason to fight. The next morning, they rode to the nearest town with a federal marshal, Harlan Coyle, slung over his horse, still bound. Thatcher gave a full statement, omitting nothing about his role at Pine Ridge or Harlan's vendetta. The marshal, a weary man who had seen every kind of human ugliness, listened patiently. With Harlan's capture and the testimony of Dr. Hervey and others in Bellstone, Clara was officially and legally freed from any claim Harlan had on her. The marshal then drew up adoption papers. Thatcher signed them with a steady hand. Clara read. It was real now, written in law and sealed with ink. They returned to the valley not in triumph, but in quiet peace. The work of rebuilding began. They mended the door, replaced the windows, and swept away the last of the dust from the storm. The scars on the cabin remained, but like the scars on their hearts, they were a testament to what they had endured together. Months passed. Spring arrived, breathing new life into the valley. The fields turned green, wildflowers bloomed on the hillsides, and the air was filled with the song of birds. The rhythm of the ranch returned steadier and more peaceful than before. One clear morning, Thatcher packed their saddlebags for a journey. "There's one last thing we need to do," he said. They rode for 2 days back, toward the desolate, forgotten corner of the territory known as Pine Ridge. It was a bleak, wind-swept place, littered with the ghosts of failed homesteads and broken dreams. Thatcher led them to a small, overgrown plot of land, where a simple weathered wooden cross stood crookedly in the earth. There was no name on it. "This is it," Thatcher said quietly. "Daniel's grave." He knelt and straightened the cross, then took a new one he had carved from sturdy oak from his saddlebag and drove it firmly into the ground beside the old one. He had carved a single name into it, Daniel. Clara stood watching, her heart full. She thought of her own mother, Lida, buried in some unmarked grave she would never find. She thought of the red ribbon, the symbol of a freedom her mother never got to see. For months, she had kept it tied in her hair, a symbol of her own defiance. Now, with slow, deliberate fingers, she untied it. The silk was frayed and faded, but it still held the memory of her mother's touch. She stepped forward and tied the ribbon to Daniel's new cross. The splash of red was bright and vivid against the gray landscape, a small, defiant flame of remembrance. It was an act of peace, a gesture that freed not only the spirit of the lost boy, but the memory of her mother and the last vestiges of her own painful past. They were all free now. They rode home in comfortable silence, the setting sun at their backs. That evening, back in the warm, safe glow of the cabin, Clara opened the leather-bound journal Thatcher had given her. She turned to a fresh page. The story she had started no longer felt right. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and began again, her script clear and confident. Her story was no longer about being sold. It was about choosing to stay. About a man who had lost everything and found redemption in the eyes of a child. About a girl who had been stripped of her name and had fought to claim a new one. It was a story of a home built not of wood and nails, but of courage and forgiveness. A story of a family built from ash and regret, now as strong and enduring as the mountains that watched over their valley.